Welcome grade 11 learners to another installment of Life Sciences. Today we're looking at homeostatic control, and if you recollect from the past couple of weeks, we've looked at nutrition, we've had an overview of nutrition, we looked at the processes involved in nutrition, and today we're looking at homeostatic control. And essentially what we're going to look in this lesson is we're going to look at what is homeostasis and what happens in the body in terms of in terms of the process of homeostasis. And I think that's very important for us to remember, that the body needs to be maintained in a constant internal environment. So we're going to unpack the word homeostasis. We're going to look at how the body maintains homeostasis, and the context of eating and the process of nutrition. We're going to look at how some of the eating disorders affects humans. So let's get straight into this, and let's look at the significance and the importance of nutrition. So when we look at the word homeostasis, the word homeostasis is made up of two words, home and stasis. So home refers to an environment. In the context of the human body, it refers to the internal body, and stasis refers to something being constant or the same. And we've got to remember that the body needs to be kept at some kind of internal constant medium. And with that, we've got to recollect from grade 10 that enzymes function at an optimum temperature. The body functions at an optimum temperature. The blood has a specific pH. And hence, when we look at the context of maintaining that constant internal environment, we've got to remember that the body constantly tries to bring about a stable internal environment so that enzymes function, so that other physiological processes occur at a normal rate. And hence, I think it's very important for us to understand that even though we eat food and we take in food, the body needs to undergo several processes to be able to firstly maintain homeostasis and also acquire energy through the process of nutrition. So the importance of homeostasis is to maintain an internal environment of the organisms, especially the higher vertebrates, in a steady and balanced state. So essentially what we're saying that the internal environment has to be maintained constant, and that, as I said, for the functioning of all other physiological reactions. It's also to establish optimum conditions of an organism. And as we said, you know that when there's a lack of oxygen in the body, you tend to get tired. When there's too much of carbon dioxide in the body, which we'll do in the next lesson or two, you'll see that could lead to the buildup of lactic acid and will lead to you being fatigued. When we have too much of food, we then tend to get rid of some of it, but some of it is stored and converted into fat. And that's essentially to get rid of the excess sugar, the excess amino acids, and even the excess fats. And that's how the body tries to maintain a constant internal environment. And if that's not maintained, then we get disorders, which we're going to look at. Cool. So I have quite a good illustration, and often we try this. And here's quite a good illustration of how an individual constantly, well, the body in this case, tries to constantly manage an internal environment at some optimum level. And it's never a stable environment. It constantly fluctuates between increasing or decreasing until it reaches an optimum level. And ideally, that the body will carry out several processes to maintain a constant internal environment. And that's essentially the importance of homeostasis in the context of nutrition. Cool. So let's look at some terminology before we get into the context of homeostasis. So we've discussed nutrition and we looked at the processes involved in nutrition in the past. Today we're going to unpack homeostasis, and we said that homeostasis was made up of the home and stasis, and essentially home environment and stasis being constant. So it's a constant internal environment that the body needs to be maintained. We're going to look at an important concept, and I think we're going to deal with this concept at greater depth in grade 12, but I think you guys need to understand this and remember this for grade 12. Negative feedback. What does that mean? And obviously it's going to be unpacked later, but it's a process where the body responds to a change and brings about a change in an opposite manner so that the constant internal environment can be maintained. So I'll explain that concept when we look at an example. We have discussed what exocrine is and refers to glands and how they release their secretions via ducts or tubes. And we've referred to endocrine glands, and in this case we refer to the pancreas being a gland that releases its secretions via directly into the blood. So we refer to those glands as being endocrine, of which we'll do several more glands that are endocrine in grade 12. We obviously need to unpack eating disorders such as kwashiorkor, marasmus, obesity, anorexia, and bulimia. So I think it's very important for us to be able to understand how these disorders arise and what are the key factors or components that are lacking or in excess in each one of these diets. So let's get straight into the content for today. So, as I discussed, what is homeostasis? I said that it is the ability of the body to maintain a constant internal environment in response to environmental changes. We know that currently we're experiencing winter, the temperature drops. What happens? What must the body do to maintain a constant body temperature? Yes, it needs to tap into some energy. You feel hungry in winter. Why is that? Because when you take in food, your body produces heat, and that heat is important in maintaining a constant body temperature. So we know that as the environment changes, be it temperature, be it in terms of the food that we consume, things that we smell, the body will undergo a mechanism to respond to that change so that it can maintain a constant internal environment. Homeostasis is maintained through the secretion of hormones. When we look at homeostasis in the context of the endocrine system, we know that we discussed exocrine glands, but the endocrine glands, these glands, so I'm just going to spell that again for you guys. When we look at the endocrine glands, okay, I'm just going to block that out. When we look at let's go again. Let's look at the endocrine glands. When we look at the endocrine glands, these release hormones, and these hormones target specific organs, and they bring about a change. And that ultimately is to maintain a constant internal environment in terms of metabolism. We also know that the body cannot function exclusively just by a negative feedback mechanism using the endocrine system. The nervous system plays an important process in processing the information about the internal environment. And with the endocrine system, they bring about a control mechanism that keeps the internal environment constant, and that's done by secreting hormones. So essentially, when we look at homeostasis, it's coupled with the nervous system, the brain, as well as the endocrine glands, and how they collectively coordinate and bring about homeostasis for the optimum functioning of an organism. Let's look at some examples of homeostatic control. So some of the examples of homeostatic control that we're going to look at is how the body maintains temperature in terms of the optimum average temperature. We also need to look at how the body controls blood glucose levels. We know that the blood glucose level constantly changes, and that's got to do with the way we ingest food. So when you do consume a meal, you find that your sugar levels tend to peak, your blood glucose levels tend to increase, and that's essentially because of the food that you ingest. We've got to look at how the body brings about and maintains a normal blood sugar level. We also know that the pH of the blood can change, and that's got to do with the carbon dioxide in our blood. And hence we need to inhale and exhale, and that mechanism of controlling the breathing rate is essential in terms of maintaining a normal oxygen level, and that in turn maintains an optimum pH in the blood. And hence you know that when you exercise and you do get fatigued, the amount of oxygen in the body does change, the carbon dioxide concentration increases, and that can lead to the buildup of some of an acidic compound in the blood, and that can change the pH of the blood and thus affect enzyme functioning, as well as body fluids. So cool, so those were some of the key elements that we needed to discuss. Let's look at some other concepts. An example of homeostatic control, as I discussed earlier on, is blood sugar. We know that the blood sugar levels in the body are controlled by a gland called the pancreas, and we looked at this gland and we said that it is both an endocrine gland and an exocrine gland. Today we're looking at the endocrine function of the gland. During the process of nutrition, we looked at the exocrine function where it produced the pancreatic juices. Today we're looking at the hormones that they secrete. And the hormones that are secreted are three very important hormones: insulin and glucagon. And these are hormones that are working antagonistically to each other. And by that I mean one brings about a change. And if I refer to that diagram of the seesaw where one is released and the other is suppressed, or in vice versa where the other is released and the other is suppressed. But we're going to talk about this using some diagrams. Where's insulin and what does insulin do? So insulin works on the cells in the liver. So it works on the liver. In these cells, it allows them to absorb glucose from the blood, and in the liver it converts excess glucose to glycogen. So the key function of insulin is to convert excess glucose to glycogen. So essentially what happens is that when the when the blood cells, when there's excess of glucose in the body, the pancreas will be stimulated to release glucose, to release glycogen, and that glycogen is converted, that excess glucose is converted to glycogen by this very important enzyme, a hormone called insulin. We also know that the glucose levels are detected by receptor cells in the body. So the glucose levels are detected by receptors in the pancreas, and high levels will cause the beta cells. So in the pancreas we have a patch of cells or patch of tissue called the islets of Langerhans. And these islets of Langerhans contain two types of tissues, two types of cells. You've got your alpha cells, and as I mentioned here, as well as your beta cells. And both of these collectively produce alpha producing glucagon, which is the other hormone that we need to discuss, and the beta producing insulin. So the beta cells will release insulin, and this in turn will lower the level of glucose and stimulate the alpha cells, which is the other cell, to release glucagon. And as I said, insulin converts glucose to glycogen, and glucagon converts stored glycogen to insulin. So essentially what's happening is that we've got a regulatory mechanism with two hormones that are released to control the blood sugar levels. And what happens when this blood sugar level is not controlled? We all commonly heard of individuals or family members or friends that are diabetic. So we have a disease called diabetes mellitus. And this is a condition where insufficient insulin is produced, or when cells are resistant to insulin because of obesity. So essentially when we look at diabetes mellitus in the endocrine in grade 12, we're going to look at there are two types of diabetes, type 1 and type 2. And essentially it's got to do with when you're born as a type 1 diabetic individual, your body is immune, your body cells are immune to insulin, and hence they do not recognize the insulin, as opposed to somebody who is obese, and in this case where the body cannot produce or it becomes intolerant to insulin, and hence the insulin does not do what it's supposed to be doing in terms of convert the excess glucose to glycogen. And that excess glucose then builds up and it remains in the body, and it affects the way metabolism occurs. And this is essentially what this means. It means that the excess glucose is not converted to glycogen, and glucose is not absorbed into the cells. So what happens then? Yes, so you'll find that individuals that are diabetic tend to be fatigued. They tend to urinate frequently. They tend to sweat a lot. And think about it. Why would somebody who's diabetic be tired? Because essentially all the sugar that you're taking into your body is not being absorbed into the cells, and hence the sugar remains in the bloodstream and it's not entering the body. You'll find that they frequently urinate, and that's part of the kidneys trying to regulate the body, and that is getting rid of the excess glucose in urine. And hence when you do a test for blood sugar levels, you can even test your urine samples and test for the levels of glucose in urine, which is an indication of diabetes. And as I discussed, the other hormone is glucagon, and glucagon converts glycogen to glucose when there is not enough glucose. So remember that there are times in the day when your body, when you feel down, when you've not had a meal, and you need that excess energy, and you feel lethargic, and that's when glycogen that's when glycogen that is stored in the liver and muscle cells is converted by the hormone glucagon into glucose. And that is how you get your glucose, and your blood sugar levels come back, and you tend to be energized and feel a bit better. So here is an illustration that I've got right here at the bottom, which essentially summarizes essentially what I've done thus far. And as I said, that when we look at the pancreas, guys, the pancreas produces two hormones. It produces, I'm going to try and illustrate this, it produces glucagon and it produces insulin. And on these, the insulin will convert, it's released by the beta cells, and these will convert the excess glucose and store them as glycogen. The fat cells take the glucose from the blood and store them. When we look at what happens when the blood sugar levels are low, you find that the pancreas releases glucagon, and these are released by the alpha cells. These are released by the alpha cells. And what does the alpha cells do? They will target the liver and the muscle cells, and they'll convert the stored glycogen back into glucose, and hence the blood sugar levels rising. So this is a kind of mechanism where two hormones function opposite each other or antagonistically to bring about homeostasis. We've got to also look at a concept in terms of what is good nutrition. And by that, how do we define good nutrition? In terms of nutrition, we refer to that process of ingesting food and the process that food undergoes during the process of digestion. But how do we describe what good human nutrition is? So we refer to good human nutrition as a diet that is balanced, that contains the essential food groups that the body needs in terms of the building blocks. So we know that we need to have food in terms of the energy requirements of the body. We constantly need to have food, and we have meals, and that's to sustain the energy that's required by the body cells to produce or to do work. And this energy is used for daily activities and life processes in terms of metabolism. So when you don't eat, you know that you're lethargic and you're tired, but the opposite does apply. When you tend to overeat, you tend to also get lethargic, and hence you need to find a balance, and that is about maintaining a good nutritional balance. The current view on human nutrition follows the food pyramid. I'm not going to get into the details of this, but essentially what this pyramid does illustrate, it illustrates the different food groups and how the different eating portions or serving portions are at different levels. So always with the pyramid, we tend to know that the base is solid, and as we get to the apex, we find that the food groups here are significantly smaller. We know that fruit are very important in our diet, and hence they form they're right at the bottom of the pillar. We need starch, but we need that in moderation. We need our unprocessed starch, so we need whole wheat, we need grains, and those grains are important at the base because they provide the essential building blocks in terms of the complex carbohydrates that the body needs for the process of nutrition. And they're complex because it's better to consume complex carbohydrates because they are gradually broken down and they give you sustained energy. Then we're looking at vegetables, and we know that it might not be your favorite, guys, but we know that they're very important in terms of providing us with the micronutrients, fiber, the essential amino acids and building blocks that are required for repair, growth, and normal metabolism in the body. And as we go up further, you find that the quantity of dairy products and proteins tend to decrease, and people tend to follow different diets, and people would argue this based on the type of diet that you choose. But you find that you cannot consume too much of protein because that protein can also be converted to fat. Your dairy products, again, are products that also contain high amounts of plant or animal material, and often it's animal protein or fat, and that can tend to be converted to fat. And here we find often what is the sugars and your foods that are laced in sugar, and your jams, your toffees, your sweets, your creams, your ice creams, and that essentially is what you should be having the least of in terms of your diet. But I'm not a nutritionist. I'm not talking to you about what you should eat and not, but I think whatever you do have, you need to have it within the balance, and you should be having meals that are rich in vegetables. You should have your complex carbohydrates, balance it out with having lots of water, have the essential proteins, have less sweets, have less fizzy drinks and carbonated sugar drinks, and rather have lots of natural unprocessed food. So I think talking about food, I know that you guys are going to probably feel a bit hungry. Maybe have a quick stretch break. When we get back after the break, we're going to tackle some questions. Welcome back, guys. Hope you had a good stretch. Probably grab something to eat, something wholesome. Let's get straight into it. And talking about wholesome, let's look at something called malnutrition. And what does malnutrition mean? And often mal comes from the word malicious, bad, and hence we're looking at nutrition that is not good. How do we define malnutrition? So it's defined as poor nutrition that's not well balanced, where a diet lacks in something essential, or a diet that is in excess of something that is essential but excess of it. So there are two main types of malnutrition: undernutrition, as well as overnutrition. As I said, some individuals tend to overeat certain food products, and that might be due to several reasons, maybe the lack of the other, while some other individuals tend to undereat certain food groups, and these both can create malnutrition or eating disorders. So undernutrition is caused by a lack of food, Examples of this is kwashiorkor, marasmus, and anorexia. So individuals that suffer from kwashiorkor, marasmus, and anorexia are individuals that are undernourished. Essentially what that means is that they lack some of the basic or a food group in their diet. We also have overnutrition, and this is caused by excessive eating of rich food stuff. And by rich food stuff, we don't mean rich in terms of monetary value. We refer to food that is rich in your kilojoules, rich in calories, that are high in sugar. And these diets are often high starch diets, high sugar diets, or sugar diets that are laced with lots of cream, ice cream, sugar. And these provide lots of energy. And what happens to that energy? If it's not utilized, it gets converted into fat. And this is a condition that can lead to obesity. And hence, we've got to find that balance to maintain homeostasis. So you see, we will look at these examples, and I've created opportunities for us to have a discussion when we look at these multiple choice questions next. So cool. So in this activity, I'm going to read through these and give you a chance to have a very quick go at this, probably 2 minutes, but let's read through this, and while I give you the 2 minutes, I'm going to flip through these various multiple choice questions so that you can have a go at it, and then when we get back, we will look at the answers. So let's read through them first, read the options, and then we move on, and I'll give you 2 minutes. Question 1.1. Which term describes, so here we've got to describe a term, a wave of muscular contraction that moves material along the gastrointestinal tract towards the anus. So GI refers to the gastrointestinal tract towards the anus. A is peristalsis, B pendular motility, C segmentation, and D hostile churning. My God, I haven't heard of that before, but we'll give it a shot. Let's go on to question 1.2. Kwashiorkor is a disease that is caused by a diet deficient in A, kilojoules, B, carbohydrates, C, vitamins and nutrients, or D, proteins. Question 1.3. Malnutrition is defined as A, excessive eating of energy-rich food, B, a lack of food, C, binge eating and purging of meal, or D, poor nutrition. Let's move on to 1.4. Vegans eat A, vegetables, white meat, chicken and fish, and cheese. B, vegetables only, no animal products at all. C, vegetables, eggs, cheese, and milk. D, only soya products. Let's move on to 1.5. The function of insulin is to A, convert glycogen into glucose, B, facilitate the movement of proteins out of the cell, C, facilitate the movement of glucose from the blood stream into cells, and D, convert excess glucose into lipids. So guys, I'm going to flip through these over the next 2 minutes. I'm going to leave it at 1.5, I'm going to go back to 1.4, I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to work through each one, and when we do get back, we'll go through the solution. So have a discussion, let's get to some of these answers. Let's look at some of these answers, and I'm sure you had a discussion, probably a bit confusing, but I think they were quite simple, quite accessible. Let's look at some of the solutions that I've suggested. So, question 1.1, which term describes the wave of muscular contractions that move material along the gastrointestinal tract towards the anus? And guys, without even looking at the options, we know that the term muscular contraction along the alimentary canal is referred to as peristalsis. So the answer here in this case is peristalsis. Nevertheless, I'm going to look at the rest. Pendulum motility, never heard of that. Segmentation, we looked at that in invertebrates. And horse churning has probably got to do with some physiological medical condition. I really don't know, but I'm focusing on peristalsis because I know that is my answer. Let's look at 1.2. Kwashiorkor is a disease caused by a diet deficient in. Is it kilojoules? I doubt. Carbohydrates? Sounds a bit confusing. Proteins and nutrients? Possibly. Proteins, and I think this is it. The key one is proteins. We know that kwashiorkor is a disease that is associated with a diet that's deficient in proteins. So diets in which there's a high carbohydrate intake but lacking proteins. And I'm sure you've seen these images in your textbooks. 1.3. Malnutrition is defined as. As we did this, is it excessive eating of energy-rich foods? I doubt. Lack of food? I doubt. Binge eating and purging of a meal? That's definitely not it. Or is it poor nutrition? And as I said at the start, mal refers to malicious, bad. Nutrition is the way you acquire food. So malnutrition is defined as poor nutrition, or the way in which individuals acquire food or take in types of food. 1.4. Vegans. What do they eat? Well, you get different types of, you get vegans, you get vegetarians, and I think you've got to go and read about this. But when we look at vegans and compare them to vegetarians, vegetarians tend to eat, green, predominantly plant material or plants or associated fruits and vegetables, but they also will eat animal products like cheese, milk, and dairy products that have been made, but they will not consume meat products. And if we compare them to vegans, vegans will be individuals that eat only vegetables and no products at all that have been produced or have come from an animal. In this case, we're looking at, let's look at it. So vegetables, white meat, and cheese. Well, that will be somebody like most of us. B, vegetables only, no animal products at all. And that's essentially what a vegan is. It's somebody who has vegetable products only with no animal products at all. That includes no meat, no eggs, no milk, and not even dairy products that have been made, often not even dairy products. C, vegetables. Okay, well, we got to this. We said vegetables, eggs, cheese, and milk. That's most of us, and that's a vegetarian. Soya product. Well, I'm not too sure who these individuals are, but the answer we're looking for in this case would be vegetables only, no animal products at all. Let's look at 1.5, and I think this was a bit tricky, a little more reading than the rest, but I think it's quite accessible. The function of insulin is to, and guys, if we recall from earlier on, we looked at the pancreas producing two hormones. It produced insulin and the other was glucagon. And insulin has the function of converting glucose and storing it in a form called glycogen. So we know that glucose is converted to glycogen by insulin. So let's look at this. So it converts glycogen to glucose. I don't think that's the option that I discussed now. So definitely not that. And that would be what glucagon does. It facilitates the movement of protein out of the cells and glucose into the cells. I doubt. It facilitates the movement of glucose from the blood stream into the cells. And this for me sounds quite correct. It converts excess glucose into lipids. It doesn't convert into lipids, it converts them into glycogen. So that's not correct. And this would be glucose from the bloodstream into the cells. And essentially, when I discuss what the symptoms are of somebody who is diabetic, one of the problems is that the blood remains in the bloodstream because it's not being able to be absorbed into the bloodstream. And hence, individuals that are diabetic tend to be often tired, they lack energy, they're fatigued, and that's essentially because the blood glucose levels remain high, and that glucose is not absorbed into the cells that are required to produce energy for metabolism or for respiration. So cool. I hope you guys got most of them correct. There's a couple more, but I'll work through these with you. This was the last one, but I thought I'll have a discussion with you when we get to this. Let's see, 1.6. The functions of the following substances, carbohydrates, amino acids, and fats in order are. So guys, essentially what we're looking at is, we're looking at what do carbohydrates provide us with, what do amino acids provide us with, and what do fats provide us with. So when we look at carbohydrates, we know that carbohydrates provide us with energy. That's without a doubt. Amino acids are required for repair and for the production of proteins. And when we look at fats, fats are often an energy-rich reserve, and they could be a reserve energy source, or they could even be used for insulation. So I'm assuming that these are going to be quite tricky, but we can look at them. Okay, so carbohydrates for energy, amino acids for bone strength. Bone strength, guys? No. Fats for protecting the vital internal organ. Well, that seems to be correct in terms of fats, but I don't think that we got the second option correct. Carbohydrates for energy, correct. Amino acids for proteins and fats for energy. Looks quite promising. Carbohydrates for energy, amino acids for repair, and fats for energy. Both seem to be very close, and I think I would agree with that. Carbohydrates for energy, amino acids for proteins, and fats for protecting the vital organs. We do have fats that protect the vital organs, but that is not the essential function of it. So I would be confused between B and C, but if I had to choose between B and C, I would give you the answers for both B and C, as we know that amino acids are required for protein production, so they're even required for repair of damaged tissue, and that's essentially the building blocks that we refer to in terms of protein synthesis. So cool. So quite an interesting example, quite confusing, but as I said, there are two possible options in this multiple choice, and you've got to look at them, weigh them out, and choose the best in terms of if you were to do a multiple choice where two options were very similar. Choose one and give that as your choice. So let's look at some questions around terminology, and then we'll get into some other detailed questions. So let's define the term homeostasis. And I know I did this at the start, so I think it's very important for us to remember this. It's important. Learn it for grade 11, remember it in grade 12. It's a process, guys. It's a physiological process of maintaining a constant internal environment in the body. So the body constantly carries out homeostasis, and that is to maintain an internal environment that is stable. Let's move on to the next question. Okay, so the flow chart below illustrates a process of feedback control involving the endocrine system. An example of this feedback system occurs in the human body when blood sugar content of the blood becomes low and needs to be controlled. So essentially what this illustration shows us, it shows us an endocrine gland, it shows us a target area, it shows us a response, and from the endocrine gland we have a messenger taking an impulse or message to the target area. The response is created, and then we add a feedback back to the endocrine gland. So essentially what we're seeing here is we're seeing a loop, or we're seeing a feedback mechanism, and that is where the term feedback comes from. So here we're finding that the term negative feedback refers to when the body responds to changes from the norm. The body will result in a message being sent to a target organ. The target organ will then respond by bringing about a change in the opposite direction so that the body returns back to normal. And essentially that process is a process of maintaining homeostasis. So I'll repeat. So the negative feedback mechanism is a mechanism that is responsible for maintaining homeostasis. What happens? The conditions change from the norm. An endocrine gland will respond by bringing about another change, by releasing a hormone from that gland, so that that hormone can target a specific area to bring about an opposite change. So it feeds back then to the endocrine system and brings about homeostasis. And essentially what I've discussed now is the negative feedback mechanism. There are some questions on this, and I think I'm going to go through these. I'm just going to very quickly look at these. And I think that you guys, before we get into this question, we deserve a break. We'll go into a break, and then when we get back, we'll tackle this question. So a short break, and then we're back. Right, guys, in this session, we're going to wrap things up, but I think you need to pay close attention. We're going to do some interesting questions, analyze some data, and see how we maintain homeostasis with regards to nutrition. So as we discussed this question before this, here's a layout of a negative feedback mechanism between an endocrine gland and the target area. Let's look at some interesting questions based on this. For each of the following, describe how blood sugar is controlled. Blood sugar control is affected by the endocrine gland A, B the messenger, and C the target organ. So let's look at this. So we've looked at this diagram. We've looked at how the endocrine gland and the target gland respond to changes. Let's look at the options that we need to discuss. Sorry guys. So for each of the following, describe how blood sugar level is controlled by the endocrine gland. Remember that the endocrine gland that we're referring to in this case is the pancreas. And the pancreas is so the receptors are going to identify a high sugar level in the blood. The pancreas will then be stimulated to release insulin. The insulin is then going to go into the bloodstream from the pancreas and then target the liver cells and the muscle cells, allowing them to absorb some of that glucose. So when the level of blood sugar changes from normal, either becoming too high or too low, the endocrine gland releases specific hormones, and in this case we're referring to both insulin and glucagon, into the blood. And this hormone enters the bloodstream, which then will target a specific target organ and bring about a change, and that is how the endocrine gland functions. Let's look at how the messenger operates. So what would the messenger be in that diagram? The messenger refers to a specific hormone that is released by an endocrine gland into the bloodstream, which will then target a specific target organ. So the messenger in this case is the endocrine hormone. It is released into the bloodstream by the endocrine gland, and then it will travel in the bloodstream, but specific target cells have receptors that recognize that hormone and will bring about a change in response to what the function of that messenger is. And the last bit was, we just need to check the last question on that, and that was, what is the function of the target organ in this case? The target organ will then receive the stimulus from the messenger, which will then respond to bring about a change to restore homeostasis. And essentially what we're seeing is that the messenger being targeted, reaching the target organ receiving the stimulus, in this case the hormone, and bringing about a change to maintain homeostasis. Quite an interesting question. Let's get on. Discuss the role of the pancreas in maintaining the glucose balance in the body. So here we're looking at the pancreas, and as I discussed a bit, the pancreas is an endocrine gland. It releases insulin when the blood sugar levels are high, and this will convert the excess glucose and store it as glycogen. So this should not be stressed, this should be store, guys, and store it as glycogen in the liver and muscle cells. When the blood glucose levels are too low, the pancreas stops insulin secretion and increases glucagon secretion. The glucagon then converts the stored glycogen into glucose, and thus the blood sugar levels return back to normal. Essentially what we've been discussing all this far. So what we're going to do is I'm going to jump to the next activity, and this is adapted from Solutions for Life Sciences and by Macmillan. Let's look at the graph below and answer the questions that follow. Here we have an illustration, a graphical illustration of showing the diet of somebody in the morning, noon, and in the evening. And this is essentially showing the level of blood, the level of glucose in the blood, and the level of insulin in the body. So we've got blood sugar levels in the dark solid line, which is that there, and we've got blood sugar levels in the red line that is there. And as we can see, if we try to interpret this, we know that at breakfast there is food that's consumed, and that's going to cause a peak and increase in your blood sugar levels, and then we see there's a dip, there's a decrease in that, and that's got to do with your physiology and how the metabolism occurs. So the excess energy here excess energy is gone to the fat cells. The excess insulin triggers a sugar craving. So you'll notice that here you've had a meal, insulin levels increase, and the sugar is converted and stored in the body. But however, with that there is insulin that's also released, and that is why sometimes by mid-morning you tend to get hungry, and that's because of the insulin, and that triggers a sugar craving, and then sometimes you feel that you want to binge eat, you want to grab something, and often it's a good time to grab a fruit. And then you get to lunch, and then when you have a meal, your blood sugar levels again peak, and then the excess energy is then stored in fats in cells, or converted and stored as glycogen. The excess insulin then further post-lunch releases will stimulate a sugar craving, and then you get to dinner, and that's when you build up an appetite to have dinner, and this cycle continues. So let's see what interesting questions are based on this. So I'm going to read through the questions, and then we're going to have a discussion around how we interpret this in the graph. 2.1. What happens to the blood sugar level every time this person eats a meal? And we looked at it, we said that the blood sugar levels tended to increase, and we'll discuss why that happens. Question 2.2. How many meals does this person have per day? And that's clearly evident from the graph. 2.3. According to the information in the graph, what happens to the excess sugar you eat? Okay, we look at that. 2.4. Why does the insulin level only increase after the glucose level increases? And that's quite interesting to understand from a graphical perspective. Suggest what you think the straight line on the graph represents. So quite interesting questions. Again, let's get to some of these answers. So I'm going to refer back to the graph, but when we look at the graph, we've got to remember that it's an illustration of both insulin levels as well as the meal or that was ingested. So what happens to the blood sugar level every time the person eats a meal? And we know that, guys, every time you consume a meal, often that meal will contain carbohydrates, it'll contain a bit of starch, it'll contain probably sugar, or in a fruit as well. So that's going to contribute to an increase in the level of sugar, and that essentially will then trigger the pancreas to produce insulin. How many meals does this person have per day? And if we go back very quickly to that graph, we can see that there is breakfast, there is lunch, and dinner. Wow, quite a fortunate guy, having 3 meals a day, and which is quite good because we need to have 3 meals a day, and that's important. Okay, so the person does have 3 meals a day. According to the information in the graph, what happens to the excess sugar you eat? And we'll go back to the graph, but according to this, it is stored in the body as in the fat cells. So if we go back to that, the graph clearly shows you that excess energy is stored in the fat cells. And essentially, that's essentially how the body tends to store energy. They store it in the fat cells, and that energy is converted into fat, and it's kept for either insulation or as reserve energy. And that is done in all organisms that tend to become inactive in conditions when it's unfavorable. And hence they eat, consume food, rich food, so that they can store that food during unfavorable conditions. Let's look at the last 2 questions on this. Why does the insulin level only increase after the glucose level increases? And this is quite interesting. As I said, the pancreas will release more insulin so that the excess blood glucose can be converted and stored to glycogen, and thus reduces the blood sugar or the blood glucose level. So once you have a meal, insulin levels increase, and once the insulin levels increase, the excess sugar in your body will be converted by insulin into glycogen, and it's stored in the liver and muscle cells, or even in this case, the fat cells. 2.5. Suggest what you think the straight line on the graph represents. I'm going to go to that graph again, but it represents the normal blood sugar levels. So when we do go back to that graph, look at this line. So here we see, I'm just going to darken it here. Here we see a line, a straight line. And that's essentially the line around which the blood sugar level remains normal. Here we're seeing it increasing, and here we're seeing it significantly below. And hence every organism has an optimum condition, and we know that we have an optimum blood sugar level, and that needs to be maintained. And the pancreas will constantly endeavor or try to maintain this normal blood sugar levels by releasing the 2 hormones, insulin and glucagon. Quite an interesting graph to analyze and to interpret. So let's move on to a few more questions based on this. What negative effect do eating large meals have on a person? And guys, we're going to look at this graph. We can describe that without even having a look at the graph. The next question will be, describe the effect that insulin has on blood glucose levels in the blood. Name the hormonal disorder that could result as a result of diets that are high in sugar intake. And 2.9, what are the classic symptoms exhibited by a person that is affected by this disorder mentioned in question 2.7. So we're going to look at the solutions to this very quickly and try and wrap this question up before we close. So what negative effect do eating large meals have on a person? And we know that when you have a large meal, it means that you're introducing large amounts of glucose and starch to your body, and that will cause the blood sugar levels to increase. And this means that it becomes excessively high. The pancreas will then have to release more insulin, and thus the blood sugar levels is reduced. However, the excess insulin triggers a craving for more sugar. Because the body has produced excessively high amounts of insulin, it means that now the insulin triggers a craving for sugar, and hence it leads to a person eating a larger meal the next meal. And hence, if you tend to cut down the proportion of your meals, especially the amount of sugar in your meals, it's going to lead to a decrease in the craving for meals that are larger and rich in sugar. Describe the effect that insulin has on glucose levels in the body. We've done this, guys. Insulin increases the permeability of cells, and these cells are able to absorb more of the glucose, and then they convert the glucose to glycogen, thus reducing the blood sugar levels in the body. We did that, and we've discussed that earlier on. 2.8. Name the hormonal disorder that could result from a diet high in sugar intake. And that is what we've discussed at the onset. It's called type 2 diabetes mellitus, and that's essentially when a person has a constant diet high in blood sugar levels, where the person is unable to control the blood sugar levels anymore. And often it means that the diet is rich in sugar and carbohydrates that then needs to be controlled so that the blood sugar intake can be reduced. Individuals often end up taking synthetic insulin, and that's to control their blood sugar levels. Last question before we wrap up. What are the classic symptoms that are exhibited by a person that is affected by this disorder mentioned in question points 2.7? And as I said, frequent urination, thirsty, lethargic, or fatigue. And as I explained, often these individuals lack an intake of sugar, lack the cells absorbing the sugar, and hence they appear tired. From my side, guys, take care, work smart, work hard.